My name is Jeremy Till. I am head of Central St Martin's, and I am here to be the only person not to be introduced, so I had to introduce myself. I'm here to introduce Gray, who will then introduce Caroline. But first of all, I just want to set the context for this event. Most universities subject incoming professors to inaugurals, which are terrifying because you have to justify your existence and your new position to a wide and often skeptical audience. UAL doesn't have such a thing. Instead has professorial platforms, and people are nominated to give it after a certain period of time. I'm slightly hoping that my nomination to give mine will be after I've left. Caroline was put forward by Central St Martin's and gracefully accepted the invitation, rightly because she has been, can I say how long you've been here? I can. She has been at this august institution for 40 years, and therefore it's quite right that she is giving her professorial platform, let's call it inaugural, right now. But I'm not here to talk about Caroline. I'm here to introduce Gray Gowrie, who is sitting here, who is going to be introducing Caroline. Gray, I think, probably doesn't need any introduction, but I will give it anyway. He had a distinguished political career, including as Minister of Arts, and then moved on after government to be Chairman of Sotheby's, Chairman of the Arts Council, and Provost of the Royal College of Art. So far, so great and good, but what distinguishes Gray's career is that he is also a practitioner. He's a poet, a distinguished poet. Early in his career, he was assistant and friend to the seminal American poet Robert Lowell, and more recently has gone back into poetry, and his collected works have been published. He was also an academic, so I can think of no one better to introduce, and it was also, when he was chairman of Sotheby's, very generous in providing or getting sponsorship for students here at Central St Martin's, or at Central and St Martin's as it then was, I guess. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Gray Gowrie to then introduce Caroline Dakers.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Since you started with the mention of subsidy, I think I must bow my head to someone who subsidized me not to introduce Caroline, which I will do with pleasure and feelers. But as you see, I'm a one-legged wonder, and for my transportation in London, I'm sponsored by the London magazine, and we are covering a lot of the arts now, as well as publishing poetry and short fiction, so jolly well all take out a subscription. I'm very proud and honored to introduce Professor Caroline Dakers, who's really much better known in this neck of the woods than I am. But she kindly asked me to do so, and after a purely British, a purely perfunctory, a kind of all shucks show of reluctance, I was thrilled to accept. Professor Dakers is an accomplished and remarkable woman. My wrist and my fountain pen, because you're looking at a 21st century freak of nature, a cyber virgin who has never sent an email, never typed a line of verse or prose, a spoiled member of the infinitely ancient regime whom they used to give secretaries to. My wrist and my fountain pen attempted to scrawl, Caroline Dakers is a very promising young woman. For that is exactly what she was when first I met her. She was not Professor Dakers. She was not Dr. Dakers. She was not even Ms. Dakers, as the prefix had not yet crossed the Atlantic. The year was, I think, 1970 or 71, and Miss Dakers and I were interned in the Department of English at University College London. She was 18 or 19 and an undergraduate. I was 29 or 30 and a lecturer fresh from Harvard and hired to inject some American literature into the curriculum. Our joint boss was the late and great Frank Kermode. UCL ran a tutorial system. I preferred lecturing and look back on my lectures on Henry James and T.S. Eliot with some pleasure, and Caroline was for a time my tutee. She was a nightmare pupil. Her essays were always meticulously researched, clearly written, and absolutely on time. I'm by nature somewhat disorganized, and in a way that was as deeply uncool then as it is now, I was leading a double life as a government whip in the House of Lords. Even worse, from the point of view of UCL, it was a Tory government. I was also writing and publishing poems which then as now was slightly less uncool. Miss Dakers no doubt pursed her lips at the politics and went on delivering work of lucidity and range. After she graduated, we became friends, and I'm honored to be the godfather of her elder daughter, Harriet, and a kind of honorary godfather of her younger daughter, Madeline. I left academe, as Jeremy has told us, for public and commercial life. Those amateurs at the House of Lords got into their heads that I'd been a don at the London School of Economics. I failed to disillusion them, and so ended up as a Treasury spokesman with a seat in the cabinet. Caroline left UCL for this great and present institution, in an earlier guise maybe, but she's been a faithful and fecund contributor to its present standing for, as you've just heard, 40 years. After a time, as Jeremy has said, I became provost, which is to say chancellor, university chancellor, of the Royal College of Art, and one of my duties there was to stand for hours in the Albert Hall wearing a heavy gilded robe and a mortarboard. While everyone else was comfortably seated, I had to dish out diplomas to graduates and honorands. One such was a Master of Arts scroll to Caroline. "Can't we pinch her?" I asked her tutor, Christopher Frayling, later still. "Only if you sack me," he replied. Well, Chris and Caroline are among our most renowned and absorbing cultural historians. Chris is the great expert on the spaghetti western. Caroline on late 19th and early 20th century haute bohème. Henry James knew all about haute bohème, so perhaps I did light a spark. Tremendous research into the Holland Park artists and their residences, on the Wyndham and Morrison families as art patrons, certainly paid off for Caroline and her admiring readers. During my period chairing Sotheby's, I brought a 10 million quid constable that the Morrisons had owned to the firm. I also admire her writing about the cultural and rural background to the First World War, and I have a soft spot for her very first book, A Useful Guide to the Blue Plaques of London. She can also draw well and accurately, and I'm the proud owner of an architecturally exact drawing of the exterior of 34 King Street Covent Garden, whose top 2 floors I used to occupy when I was at UCL. Now, in the central St. Martin years, most of Caroline's pupils were makers, and many, I'm sure, here tonight, artists, designers, ceramicists, and the like. It seems to me that a sense of context, of one's cultural forebears, so to say, is essential compost for creative fertility. Where the fine arts are concerned, I grew up in the era of formal values, or plastic values as they used to be called, the painting or sculpture as a self-sufficient analogue of the world. We lived and looked under the shadow of Cézanne. For the last 30 years or more, our culture, we have lived and looked under the shadow of Marcel Duchamp. Speaking for myself, I'd rather like now to get out from under old Marcel and give the artwork as an imaginative idea of itself a rest for a few years. Less tail chasing, everyone. Things move on and they also come round again. So please attend to your cultural historians. They map the country you're going to occupy, and you're lucky to have them. Ladies and gentlemen, Caroline Dakers.
Thank you to Gray for introducing me. Thank you to Jeremy for introducing Gray. Thank you to Janet for proposing that I might do this talk, to Phil for designing the brochure and the poster, to CSM and UAL for all the support in organising the event. As your booklet explains, my lecture is not about a book that I've already written, but instead about a new research project, which has emerged from my teaching and my writing over the 40 years that I've been at Central St Martin's. So this is very much a work in progress. It's a bit of a risk, and I'm trying it out on you. Soon after I began teaching in the Liberal Studies Department of the Central School of Art and Design, I offered a seminar called Artists in Literature, taken by students from all the disciplines offered by the college. We read a range of texts, from Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott. Let me check, it works. Yep. For the textile students, and Keats' Ode to a Grecian Urn for the ceramicists, to John Fowles' The Ebony Tower for the painters. The Brontes provided women artists in Jane Eyre and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. One of the students' tasks was to invent and present to the group their own fictional artist. The Bohemian type figured large, and with it the familiar scenario of poverty, lack of recognition, excessive alcohol, and sex. The successful artist did not appear to make for a riveting story. Meanwhile, I used part of the research for my PhD in my first academic book, The Countryside at War, 1914 to 18. One of the themes of the book is the response of artists and writers to the war, not just through their creative work, but also in their actual lives. Also the public's perceived role for art in war. I found myself contrasting the bravery of John and Paul Nash serving with the artists' rifles, recording their experiences as artists and soldiers, to the casually pacifist position of Bloomsbury artist Duncan Grant. I also discovered bizarre representations of contemporary art and artists, in Punch, for example. In a later book, The Holland Park Circle, I studied a previous generation of British artists who between 1850 and 1900 enjoyed extraordinary wealth and social status. They were celebrities, many living in grand studio houses in Kensington, Chelsea and St John's Wood. In addition to election to the Royal Academy, some were rewarded by the state with knighthoods, baronetcies, and in the case of Frederick Leighton, a peerage. They were hardly Bohemians. Indeed, the majority wanted to be accepted as gentlemen, as did many of their nouveau riche patrons. In another book, Clouds, the biography of a country house, I used material from my MA at the Royal College of Art. I followed the life of a particular house from the mid-19th century when it was a famous location for art patronage. Artists performed for their aristocratic hostess and hostesses across Saturdays to Mondays, to the end of the 20th century and its current role as a centre for the treatment of drug addiction and alcoholics. Richard Wyndham, the last aristocrat to own Clouds, was also an artist an art collector, a writer, a bon viveur, and a champagne bohemian. His preference for tying up girlfriends with ropes provided his sometime friend Wyndham Lewis with the excuse to dub him the ape flagellant in his book, The Apes of God. But their significant falling out was really over money. And money is a theme throughout my talk tonight, money. Wyndham Lewis, the archetypal misunderstood genius who played the part of the Bohemian, could not understand why the wealthy aristocrat, Richard Wyndham, the gentleman artist of mediocre talent, shouldn't share some of his wealth with him and thus support great art. In 1948, Richard Wyndham was shot dead in Lebanon, reporting on the conflict between Arabs and Jews. I thought he would make an exciting book. He'd been one of the models for the artist Charles Ryder in Evelyn Ward's Brideshead Revisited. While Ryder took to the jungles of Central America, he went to southern Sudan for inspiration. He also collected contemporary European art, Picasso, Severini, at a time when British taste was set against the modern. And he left a fascinating diary recounting the experiences he had in war-torn Middle East. But the publishers felt that no one would buy a book about someone virtually unknown. So I came by this circuitous route to my new project, Bohemians and Gentlemen, with walk-on parts for all the artists and the collectors and the patrons from all my previous projects, but also a place for that early seminar, Artists in Literature. Because my overarching theme is how artists have been represented, categorized, manipulated, and mythologized. And literature is at the heart of the project. My aim is to examine the construction of the artistic identity, the imagined artist, and how it changed across an important period in British art history. The outsider, the bohemian, the artist starving in the garret, the slick businessman, the celebrity, these are some of the stereotypes at the heart of my project. For the tricky definition of the bohemian, I'm borrowing from a book recently published called On Bohemia, The Code of the Self-Exiled. Number one, an attitude of dissent from the prevailing values of middle-class society, artistic, political, utilitarian, sexual, usually expressed in lifestyle and through a medium of the arts. And two, a cafe. I shall be using artists' self-portraits, photographs, memoirs. I look at cartoons, but my focus is always the representation of the artist. My time frame between 1850 and 1950 is a key century for the artist in Britain. During this period, artists experience an extraordinary change in their status and their wealth. And the change mirrors the rise and then fall in the status of Britain as a world power. The period 1850 to 1900 has been dubbed the golden age for artists in Britain. 50 or more years of rising wealth and social status. It gave way to another 50 years from 1900 to about 1950, in which for young modern artists, neither income nor employment was easily found. Kenneth Clark, writing in 1961, observed despairingly, "In England, the majority is not merely apathetic, but hostile to art." In the booklet, you'll find proposed chapters of my book, but here I'm going to focus on a few examples to sort of whet your appetite, to wait just a few years until I've completed the book. In part one, I'm going to look at that golden age between 1850 and 1900, when artists in Britain really never had it so good. And I'm going to look at the way these artists constructed their own images. They took control in a rather extraordinary way and attracted nouveau riche collectors. And my sort of subheading for this section is anything but bohemian. And I start with Frederick Leighton, the head of the Victorian art world, the most successful, most rewarded artist by the state. And he, in 1864, the year he became an associate of the Royal Academy, built himself a grand studio house, a palace of art in Holland Park. He persuaded his father, who lent him the money, that it was a good investment, reassuring him, "Whatever I do, I shall undertake nothing without an estimate." Other artists followed suit. Some built small bachelor pads, some, like Millet, went in for the grand Renaissance palace. Many artists worked with significant architects. Some became collectors and patrons of younger artists. Journalists wrote up the houses. Architectural journals published the designs. Photographers positioned the artists surrounded by their works, always looking remarkably clean and hardly ever at work. Society pages wrote up the events inside the houses. The interested public sought the exclusive tickets to gain entry to the open days in the studio. No one was quite as successful as Frederick Leighton. His first exclusive music party was given in 1867. 2 years later, he was elected a full Royal Academician. And in 1870, he appeared, thinly disguised, in Disraeli's novel Lothair, as the successful artist Mr. Phoebus. Mr. Phoebus liked pomp and graceful ceremony, and he was of the opinion that great artists should lead a princely life, so that in their manners and method of existence they might furnish models to mankind in general and elevate the tone and the taste of nations. Quite an idea. In 1878, he was knighted and he became president of the Royal Academy. In my next little section, I shall look at how some artists constructed their image not just through property, but through using history, through presenting a special and close relationship to the art and culture of the past. In Leighton's case, this was the Renaissance and the Classical Age. And here in his self-portrait of 1880, which was commissioned by the Uffizi Gallery, which was an extraordinary honour at that time, he wears the gold medal of the President of the Royal Academy, the red gown of the Doctor of Oxford University. It sounds like an experience of being Chancellor at the Royal College of Art, rather. But no wonder he paints himself like Zeus or like a Roman emperor, with his curls carefully arranged on his noble classical head. The portrait also contains within it a significant part of his house and his collection, as the copy of the Elgin marbles, which is behind him, was actually on the wall of his studio, and it's still there. And it's worth noting that the portrait took him only 3 days to complete, and that there's no suggestion in it whatsoever of the artist at work. He also produced historical paintings about art. His take on history, his depiction of Renaissance artists, is part of this grand self-presentation of himself and his Palace of Art. So Cimabue's celebrated Madonna, I'm not going to read out the full title, was Leighton's first bravura offering to the Royal Academy in 1855 and bought by the Queen, and that mattered in the middle of the 19th century, for an astonishing 600 guineas. His house, the first phase of his house, cost about £4,000. So once his paintings went up to £1,000 or guineas each, he only had to do 4 to build a brand new house. He was earning a huge amount of money. And Francis Haskell observed in such reconstructions of the Renaissance that we do not turn to paintings of this kind for scholarly information. Artists are using such images as propaganda for their own profession. And this was certainly the case with Leighton. However, Leighton had his critics, both of his art and his personal life. His art education had been in Europe, not in England. He never married, but there were whispers of connections to models, female models, and to married women. On the other hand, he spent some time travelling not just in Italy, but in Egypt and the Near East. In those days, that meant that he also attracted rumours that he was bi or homosexual. George du Maurier wrote to his sister in the 1860s after attending a soiree with Leighton. Cimabue was there. Cimabue was there. I don't know whether you would like him, very blasé and finikin and quite spoilt, one of the world's little darlings who won't make themselves agreeable to anything under a duchess. And George du Maurier went on to write his novel about art student life, Trilby, recalling his experiences when a young art student. And his fellow artist friends in the novel were all decidedly English, and they were manly men. They even took up boxing in the studio when the model arrived late. And this brings me to my next section. Manly men who used English history, not classical or Renaissance. They stuck to English stories. And this group of artists were known as the School of Slashed Breeches, or the St. John's Wood clique. There were many other artists doing the same sort of work, but I here want to just look at this group as a contrast to Leighton and to show how they constructed their image. They were invariably described in the journals as manly men. They were clubbable. They played jokes. They went on long country walks, staying at English inns, and they wrote about it. They were patriotic, and they joined the artist rifles. They were mostly married. If they ventured abroad, it was to look at paintings at the Salon in Paris, never the Mediterranean, and certainly not the Near East. David Wilkie Winfield, their photographer, photographed himself and them in these extraordinary costumes, which you can see examples of here. And he was an authority on heraldry and armorial bearings. And he showed some of these photographs in London in a public exhibition, and then put some of them together in a volume, a publication, which came out in 1864. And George du Maurier, who's up there in a bit of armour, wrote, "There's a man called Winfield Jr. who's been taking large photographs of several of the fellows in 15th and 16th century costumes, and they're splendid. They're like sort of old boys playing games together." All of them collected bits and pieces of armour, and Henry Stacey Mark's first success at the Royal Academy was toothache in the Middle Ages. And in 1866, they rented Hever Castle, and they spent the whole summer down there working on paintings together. And at Hever, and I really like this slide because you see how they dressed when they were really at work as artists. I also want you to note the beards. I know beards are now out of fashion again, but at this moment in time they were definitely in, and as long and as bushy as possible. So down at Hever, they decided to behave well because their families were with them, their wives and their children, and they agreed to use only clothed models. And you see this theme, this Bohemian gentleman, only clothed models. And it's very interesting that just a few years before, 1860, The Woman in White was published, written by Wilkie Collins. And I'm just going to read you a little quote from this because it fits this image of the artist. The status of its hero, the artist Walter Hartwright, is explained to, quote, a fat and mighty merchant living in Portland Place. The merchant asks about Hartwright. Is he a foreigner or an Englishman? Is he respectable? Sir, the immortal fire of genius burns in this Englishman's bosom, and what is more, his father had it before him. Never mind about his genius. We don't want genius in this country unless it is accompanied by respectability. And then we're very glad to have it. Very glad indeed. Englishness, respectability, the attributes of a gentleman, these are much more important than artistic talent. And one of the paintings, you may want to apply that to this particular painting, one of the most famous paintings produced in the whole of the 19th century was Frederick Yeam's He with the Beard. Frederick Yeams's And When Did You Last See Your Father? Yeams was inspired by Hever, He showed this at the Royal Academy. He became elected a fellow. It was reproduced endlessly in engravings. And it's been claimed, as I say, not just to be the most famous of all Victorian pictures, but one of the most reproduced. And it was bought by the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool the same time it was shown in the Royal Academy. Roy Strong comments about these sorts of pictures, and here we have something from the Civil War. And he worked out, by looking at all the paintings on show at the Royal Academy, that the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, Charles I, Parliament were the most popular historical paintings in the 19th century, all giving a particular image of England, but also linking the art to the new collectors who were emerging. And I'm quoting here from Strong. Victorians had their vehicle par excellence for living out their own dilemmas, the dilemmas they faced as the middle classes gradually won ascendancy and power passed to them from the old landed gentry. As the new self-made upper classes, born of the purple of commerce and manufacture, fought for acceptance in the closed world of the old nobility and county families. And I'm just going to leap into the middle of the 20th century briefly to show you what later happened to Eames's painting. We are now in Madame Tussauds in the Euston Road, Baker Street. And this is an almost exact three-dimensional version that was made of the Eames painting, still on display, still written up on the Madame Tussauds website. Extraordinary things happen to paintings in their lives and then after. And this is very much what I'm interested in for my paper and my book. These strategies worked. I've mentioned the nouveau riche, the new collectors coming on the scene. And for many of these artists, this was what it was all about. They found the money from these collectors. They appealed to these collectors. The increased wealth of artists in the second half of the 19th century was directly the result of the emergence of a new class of collectors made rich from the Industrial Revolution and the Empire, who wanted to emulate the aristocracy by buying art. But instead of buying old masters, and they were afraid that they were forgeries, there were a lot of forgeries coming out of Italy, they chose the work of living artists, many displayed at the Royal Academy's annual summer show, and many considerably more expensive than old masters. For these newly rich men, often anxious about their own positions in society, the social position of the artist was of significance, his or her status as important as their own. Thus the artist's studio houses, their personal collections of art, their apparent scholarship, their knowledge and their depictions of history, all built up confidence in the minds of prospective buyers. Their works would undoubtedly be good investments. Artists who were manly men appealed to collectors, made rich from their exploits in the British Empire. George McCulloch, who took this photograph, is an example of a collector who amassed a huge collection very quickly as part of his bid to enter London society. He made his fortune through owning the largest silver mine in Australia. He returned to London, having married his housekeeper and adopted her son, actually their son. His early art education and experience of collecting was through acquiring cheap engravings of his favourite pictures out in Australia. These engravings, of course, contributing to the incomes of the artist back in England. Once the millionaire had arrived back in England, he set about collecting the originals. It's interesting that he acquired Alma Tadema's painting, The Sculpture Gallery, which presents a not uncritical commentary on the nature of collecting. Though supposedly a painting of classical Roman times, it's all about money. The collector and his friends are choosing between a complicated mixture of really old and copies of the old, Roman copies of Greek originals, of the truly valuable and the gaudy. McCulloch was also, in buying this painting, acquiring a portrait of the artist, as Alma Tadema paints himself as one of the potential purchasers on the left with his arm out. He's pointing at the largest, but not the most important object for sale. He's pointing at a tazza with a carved figure of the mythological sea creature Scylla on its base. Lower in terms of value than the sculptures in the background. So what's Alma-Tadema suggesting about himself and about the art world, including a collector such as McCulloch? Elizabeth Prettyjohn suggests he's mocking the conventions of traditional history painting, placing the central figure as a material object, the huge tazza of little value. I mentioned that McCulloch had taken that earlier photograph, and he in fact took a whole series of photographs of artists, the artists whose works he owned, sitting and standing in front of their works, in front of his collection. So here he's seated in front of the Alma-Tadema that you've just seen, and Alma-Tadema's wife, Lady Alma-Tadema, is seated also in front of the painting in which she has been included by her husband. And he arranges all these photographs that he took in an album, a special album, as if creating a new portable collection of his own. So his photos of his artists are set in front of the paintings he has been able to buy. After his death, his widow married a much younger man, an artist, and sold most of his collection, eventually establishing a hospital in their Kensington home. And in 1913, she sent one painting back to Broken Hill in New South Wales, where he had made his fortune in the first place, to the newly founded museum and gallery. The choice of what painting to be sent to Australia was interesting. Arthur Hacker travelled extensively in Spain and Morocco, and here depicts what appears to be the moment before a mass rape of women in Morocco. Comments on the Broken Hill website now suggest it is regarded at one and the same time as deeply non-PC and a favourite among visitors to the gallery. I'm now going to move to the middle section of my proposed book. I'm going to be exploring much more in the book about the increasing criticism by critics of the archetypal Victorian realistic and narrative paintings, and also the artists themselves, who were taking a very different line in their work. By 1900, the divisions were clear. The public flocked to see and enjoy paintings like this: realistic, narrative, classical works, soft porn. They were there at the summer exhibition in the Royal Academy. Those works still sold for high prices. Artists continue to receive honours. But Sickert, for example, declared, "We don't go back to other days. Our history is of today." And when Alma-Tadema died in 1912, the critic Roger Fry described his work as like very good, pure, wholesome margarine. Two pieces of fiction I'm going to refer to here came out close to this shift in taste, this shift in the reception of Victorian art. And one is Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray. And in Dorian Gray, you see in a way depicted what Roger Fry wanted to do to Alma-Tadema. Dorian Gray picks up a knife and murders Basil Hallward, who has painted this portrait that has in the end destroyed his life. Hallward lives in a studio house not unlike Leighton's fabulous Palace of Art in Kensington, but his time is up, literally. Dorian Gray glanced at the picture, and suddenly an uncontrollable feeling of hatred for Basil Hallward came over him. The mad passions of a hunted animal stirred within him, and he loathed the man who was seated at the table more than he had ever loathed anything in his whole life. As soon as he got behind Hallward, he seized the knife and turned round. Hallward moved in his chair as if he was going to rise. He rushed at him, dug the knife into the great vein that is behind the ear, crushing the man's head down on the table and stabbing again and again. About the same time, in 1892, Henry James, in his story The Private Life, turned Frederick Leighton into the successful artist Lord Mellifont. He is, to quote, the public performer, the man whose whole personality goes forth in representation and aspect and sonority and phraseology and accomplishment and frontage. But inside, there is no private life. In fact, when alone, the artist completely disappears. He is an empty shell and might as well be dead. I now move rapidly into the 20th century. And here, I'm going to be shifting the way that I look at the construction of the image, because it seems that something begins to change. I've been talking about the way artists took control and constructed images that brought them an enormous amount of money. Here, I'm going to be looking at the construction of images by others, not by the artists particularly, by the media, by the public, and the possibility of being too bohemian. Epstein is not going to be a major part of the book, but for today, he is my major case study. And he and his life offer interesting insights into this way in which the media and the public took over the creation and the controlling of the image of the artist. In his autobiography, he claimed that he started out in London around 1905 in a studio in Fulham, but he was too bohemian for the other artists. In these tumble-down studios, he wrote, I was first made aware of the ludicrous snobbishness that artists were supposed to be free of. The other occupants of the studios were artists who were beginning in their careers. One day, I heard that the landlady, who lived on the premises, had been requested by the artist to have me removed from the studios, as my clothes were somewhat too bohemian for the place. Not, in fact, respectable enough. His entire life, Epstein was subject to extraordinary attacks on his background and his religion. He was Polish and Jewish. He also maintained an unorthodox lifestyle. He had children by a number of mistresses rather than by his long-suffering first wife. She got fairly cross as well and at one point shot one of the girlfriends in the shoulder, but didn't kill her. In 1908, he was commissioned by the British Medical Association to produce a series of sculptures for the Strand. He intended to produce nude men and women in the various stages from birth to old age, and the BMA had no objection. However, when the works were unveiled, the National Vigilance Association, which happened to be directly opposite the BMA building, called in the press and the police to get the work removed or at least censored. And the National Vigilance Association was a sort of group of self-styled moral guardians who were horrified by the look of the pieces of work. And the Evening Standard went a step further. They wrote, "It was a form of statuary which no careful father would wish his daughter or no discriminating young man, his fiancée, to see." They survived for a while. In 1922, Epstein was commissioned by another august body, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, to carve a memorial to the late naturalist and writer W.H. Hudson. And it was going to be in Hyde Park. He chose to depict Rima, who is a magical part girl, part bird from Hudson's novel Green Mansions, which was set in the jungles of South America. In the story, Rima is burnt to death by meat-eating natives. It has a very sad ending. The memorial, when it was unveiled in 1925 by the Prime Minister, again horrified sections of the press and the public. And in fact, it received the most hostile reception of any of his works, and probably any work in this period in the 20th century. It was the Hyde Park atrocity. It was Mr. Epstein's nightmare in stone. It was the most famous example of a great sculptor who has sold his soul to the devil. And the cartoonist David Lowe revealed in The Star one of the attacks, or he put them together actually, the attacks that were conducted by the public on Rima. It was daubed with paint. It was covered with tar and feathers. And Lowe reported it, did a cartoon, but then continued for his career to return to Epstein. Every time Epstein was attacked, David Lowe did a cartoon for the press. So what I'm really interested in here is how the image of the artist, the amount of press coverage Epstein received, the excessive nature of the language of abuse, sold his soul to the devil. And also how many cartoons were produced, built up and up, until really the general public only had to see the word Epstein to be able to picture these very, very popular cartoons. Epstein was one artist. Now I want to look just a little at the way that artists were treated in the fiction of the time, particularly fiction between the wars. And my shot from Agatha Christie's Murder at the Vicarage really sets the scene. Much popular literature of the time presented similar responses. They were all about fear, suspicion, stereotypical views of the artist as rebel, as dangerous, as homosexual, as foreign, as Jewish, even cowardly. For example, the novelist John Buchan, who wrote The 39 Steps, in his novel Mr. Standfast, which was set in the war, although it was published in 1919, really goes to town on the sort of people who buy and show modern art. His hero and man of action, Richard Hannay, a sort of James Bond of the time, ridicules contemporary art. He comes down to dinner in Foss Manor. Imagine the scene. The dining room was very unlike the hall. The panelling had been stripped off, and the walls and ceiling were covered with a dead, black, satiny paper, on which hung the most monstrous pictures in large, dull gold frames. They seemed to be a mere riot of ugly colour. The young man nodded towards them. "I see you've got the Degoose hung at last. How exquisite they are," cried Miss Clare. "How subtle and candid and brave. Doria and I warm our souls at their flame." Some aromatic wood had been burned in the room, and there was a queer, sickly scent about. Everything in the place was strained and uneasy and abnormal. The candle shades on the table, the gaudy hangings and the nightmarish walls. The queer, sickly scent and the monstrous French pictures are all in a house owned by people who are opposed to the war. So there's a suggestion that cowardice is the characteristic of anyone who likes contemporary art. Later, in the novels of Dorothy L. Sayers, herself married to a minor artist, we can find other examples of these rather outlandish, dangerous artists and their work. Ulfric Fiennes, in The Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club, has maybe some links to Jacob Epstein. Ulrich Fiennes, the sculptor, can't have Olga, the artist Mrs. Olga Schlitzner, his new lover, at his place because his wife's there. And he's really dependent on his wife because his sculpting doesn't pay. And besides, he's at work on that colossal group for the exhibition, and he can't move it. It weighs about 20 tons. And if he went off and took Olga away, his wife would lock him out of the place. It's very inconvenient being a sculptor. It's like playing the double bass. One's so handicapped by one's luggage. And of course, there's the Agatha Christie quote, which you've got at the top of the slide. Of course, Mr. Redding turns out to be the murderer, or rather the one who helps her lover, his lover, kill her husband, so that they can marry and enjoy the dead man's money. Instead, he's hanged. And as Miss Marple puts it, he was, like so many artists, one of those charming young men who have no moral sense at all. While novelists almost invariably presented artists as dangerous bohemians, Pathé News, Pathé Films, established in Soho's Wardour Street from 1910, was making short films about successful artists to be distributed almost instantly in cinemas all over Britain. So this is where I'm really interested in this way that images of artists just flooded the market. They went straight out to the cinemas. They were instantly transmitted. And then on across the world. Pathé's choice of artists and their subtle and not so subtle forms of censorship provide further examples of the distorted representations of artists in the period. Florentino Matania was one of the artists chosen by Pathé. He was Italian, but established a successful career as an artist in Britain before the First World War. He worked as a war artist in the war, producing the wildly popular Goodbye, Old Man. Those of you who've seen War Horse will understand the reality of this, which is now actually in the collection of the Blue Cross, which is a charity devoted to supporting pets of all sizes. After the war, his paintings, which were almost always reconstructions of the past, so this history painting was still alive and doing well, but with lashings of historical references, costumes and props, but always including an attractive nude female model, sold for high prices. And in this slide, we can see models, clothed and unclothed, posing in his enormous studio in West Kensington. There's a possibility the clothed woman is his wife, and I think you could just about make out she's got a rather angry expression. She's staring at him, and he's staring at the nude model. Pathé's film of Matania was made in 1932, silent in black and white, and it manages both to hint at his pleasure in work that involved painting naked women and present a sort of unoffensive version, here just about unoffensive, of a model posing as an Amazon on a horse. And you get the words, it's a silent movie after all, put in to, again, give you this sort of hint of what pleasure this artist had in his life. Meanwhile, Epstein continued to receive unusually critical responses to his work, and his controversial Genesis, shown at the Leicester Galleries in 1931, was directly compared back to fiction. The Times in 1931 described him as being the sculptor hero of a bad novel. And this is 3 years after Dorothy L. Sayers' Unpleasantness at the Bologna Club was published. The Manchester Guardian denounced Genesis as being anti-Christian and to exalt, quote, nothing bigger than the dark gods which glooms so flesh-hauntingly in the polytheism of the late D.H. Lawrence. Interestingly, Lawrence had died in 1930, just the year before, and his novel The Plumed Serpent, which is probably the source of the reference to the dark gods, had been published in 1926. The unexpurgated version of Lady Chatterley's Lover was not available in Britain. But also of relevance is the censorship of his own exhibition of his paintings at the Warren Gallery in Mayfair in 1929. 13,000 people visited largely in response to the extreme press reaction. After a formal complaint, the police seized 13 of the 25 paintings, and despite declarations of support from many writers, artists and MPs, Lawrence was able to recover his paintings only by agreeing never to exhibit them in England again. You'll remember those BMA sculptures. They survived just about into the 1930s, but the BMA sold their building to the government of southern Rhodesia, and it was renamed Rhodesia House, and they wanted the sculptures removed. There was a campaign in the press. The art establishment was bitter. The most notorious non-intervention, however, came from the Royal Academy. The president refused to support Epstein and his work. As a result, a number of artists left the Academy, and many others refused to be put forward for election or to submit their work. The sculptures remained until 1937, but then part of a head apparently fell onto the street. Without consulting Epstein, workmen chiseled down the sculptures, removing all offensive parts that might fall off. The same year, 1937, the Nazi Party published a book called The Eternal Jew, and they used this photograph that you've already seen of Epstein and Genesis in the publication, and this was the caption underneath it. Neanderthalic art. In sculpture, even more than painting, Jews display their absolute lack of talent. To get the attention that their vanity demands, they turn primitive. Here, Jacob Epstein, London, looks thoughtfully at his disgusting work of a pregnant idiot which he calls Genesis. The following year, Nio Marsh's novel Artists in Crime was published, and in it we have a particularly nasty death for the Bohemian sculptor Garcia. He's a true Bohemian of genius and complete unscrupulousness, and he's working on comedy and tragedy for a new cinema in London. Nitric acid is forced down his throat. Inspector Allen had a torch in his pocket. The sharp beam of light ran from the torch to the table. It ended in the man's face. It was the face of a gargoyle. The eyeballs started from their sockets. The protruding tongue was sulphur yellow. The face was yellow and blue. The whole posture suggested unspeakable torture. Epstein wasn't murdered, but one might argue his treatment during the Second World War as a Blackpool freak show was pretty close. His monumental Adam was, of course, attacked when it was first shown in 1939. In 1940, the Daily Mirror ran a headline, "Why not just bomb Berlin with Adam?" It was acquired in 1939 by Charles Stafford, and the rights sold to Lawrence Wright, a sort of impresario, who displayed it to the public in Blackpool. Here it is leaving London's art world, the Leicester Galleries, which is where Epstein's works were shown, for Blackpool. Bizarrely, in Blackpool, people queued to see it, some 20,000 in the summer of 1939, and apparently Epstein earned £15,000 from the entry fees. His next piece of work, Jacob and the Angel, was greeted in the Daily Mail by the comment, "Is this a miracle or a monstrosity?" when it was first shown at the Leicester Galleries. It too was acquired by Charles Stafford and went up to Blackpool. It was placed on sand against a painted backdrop of dunes and palm trees. It was illuminated by coloured spotlights and accompanied by an American jukebox playing soft music. For an extra 6p, the public could also see a mermaid. After the war and a tour of South Africa, the sculptures, now owned by William Cartmel, returned to Blackpool. Cartmel was running the Louis Tussauds Waxworks show on Blackpool's front. And Louis Tussauds was related to the founder of Madame Tussauds back in London, where Yeames's painting was on display. In Blackpool, the waxworks were displayed on the ground floor. Sculptures were in the basement, below a large pipe. In conclusion of my talk, but not, of course, the book, which is yet to be written, it would appear that in the second half of the 19th century, artists manipulated their own images with extraordinary effectiveness. In the first half of the 20th century, however, the situation changed for younger modern artists. Others dominated the field of image making: critics, cartoonists, novelists, all manufacturing their own images of the artist for their particular consumers and to make money for themselves, not for the artists. Powerless, or perhaps uninterested, real artists concentrated on their work. My final words come from a very short 25-second Pathé film of Jacob and the Angel, which was shot in 1942, just before it left the Leicester Galleries for Blackpool. And the film was distributed almost immediately in cinemas all over the country.
Jacob Epstein's new work, Jacob and the Angel. The duplication of names is purely coincidental. The alabaster figures weigh 4 tons. Great work.
It's mighty, terrific, massive,
magnificent,
enormous, gigantic, stupendous, colossal.
There's nothing more I can say.